things as coming from outside of myself, that potentiality for receptivity and for the givenness of the world already implies space, can only take place because of space, where something is given and received, passed from the external to the internal. So space is already implied in the very idea of sensory receptivity. It's already implied in the differentiation between myself and an external world. It's an interesting argument. We could go down several rabbit holes. I think we will hold off on doing so. So let's walk through these four arguments, which begin on 174. 175. Kant says, in the first argument, the concept of space already supposes a separation between me and the external world. That I experience extension, think extension, and cannot think without extension when it comes to empiricism and sensation means that there is a distance between me and something else. Receptivity alone implies space and vice versa. But space is inherent to the capacity for sensibility. Representation, therefore, implies space. Now, so this is another thing. When I'm thinking, when I'm alone with myself, thinking, reflecting, particularly reflecting on myself or on pure concepts, all I need is time. For example, I can think about the meaning of the good or the true without employing the intuition of space. However, whenever in my mind I am imagining, whenever in my mind I'm thinking about the external world, I am always going to have to use extension. For example, if I look over at the sweater hanging from a doorknob, I am now directly receiving it through my sensibility and the empirical intuition of space. When I then close my eyes and imagine that sweater, it's not that I am have now dispensed with the need for extension, but rather in my imagination of that sweater, I retain the idea of space. I represent that space to myself. Whenever I imagine a unicorn, some fantastical being, I still have to do so in extension, using space, some determinate measure. What that means is that in our thinking about the external world, about things outside of ourselves, is different than our thinking about our inner selves and what Kant calls pure reason, or these a priori concepts. So everything having to do with externality is always, even in thinking, grasped and intuited through space. And this is it's an interesting idea. I mean, think about, for example, an abstract idea that is nevertheless necessarily of the physical world. think of a color. Think of blue. Right? Now you might think, okay, blue is an abstract idea. I ought to be able to think blue without without the use, the intuition of extension, of space. But you can't. Right? Close your eyes and try and think about blue. You will inevitably come up with some patch of blue that will be of a certain size and shape. It will have certain dimensions. It will have some kind of extension. What that means is that blue is not a pure idea, an a priori idea. It isn't something that belongs to pure reason, but is rather what Descartes would have called an adventitious idea, an idea that I get through experience. Right? It is something that comes through sensation, not through my pure ideas. So Kant this is really the project of the critique of pure reason as a whole, determining the bounds of pure reason, what we can think of independently of the external world, not unlike Descartes' project, and those ideas which are connected to the external world. So blue would be, although it is, we might think of it as a Platonic form, we might think of it as an abstract idea, and we can certainly think blue in separation from any particular blue object. Nevertheless, blue will not be part of pure reason. It will be part of discursive reason, reason that is derived from experience and based in our sensory experience. And this is evidenced in the fact that it can only be thought through extension in unison with extension. And extension is the mark of that which is external. That which is external is not going to be where we find pure reason. All right, that was a bit of a tangent, but the more important, I think, thing to grasp here is that because we can never have any thought or experience about the external world without space, even in our minds, then space is the form of our ability to process the sensory world, and not something that exists in the sensory world. Okay, argument number 2. One can never represent that there is no space, though one can very well think that there are no objects to be encountered in it. It is therefore to be regarded as the condition of the possibility of appearances, not as a determination dependent on them. Okay, so what he's saying here is we don't get the idea of space from the experience of the external world, but rather we get the experience of the external world through the intuition of space, which is prior to that experience and which makes that experience possible. And Kant is saying we can see some evidence of this in the fact that even if we imagine absolute emptiness, the absence of any kind of object, any body, we will still inevitably think about space. We'll still encounter space. Imagine nothingness in your mind, right? The absence of body. Right? That is still going to be a void. And a void is, again, going to have dimensions, going to be determined, going to have a shape of some kind. So even emptiness, even the absence of bodies has shape, has space, And so it can't be, Kant thinks, that space is dependent on bodies because space is separable from bodies, but because bodies are not separable from space, from extension, bodies must be derived from space. Because space is non-sensory, bodies must be dependent on this non-sensory form of sensibility. Argument 3. Similarly, space is not discrete or discursive, as Kant says. We can divide space, but always understand that it is all part of the same space. Space is not a thing that is determinate or delimitable, and yet is the means of all determination and delimitation, a condition for the possibility of delimiting, but not itself delimitable. Again, space is an intuition rather than something that exists outside of ourselves, something in itself, because it itself cannot be delimited, and yet it is part of all delimitation. It is a form of sensibility. It is that which makes delimitation possible, but which must lie outside the realm of the sensible, the realm which is always delimited by extension, by space, because it is itself not delimitable. And this brings us to the fourth and final, and I think most complicated argument. Following from this idea of it being indeterminable and undelimitable, Kant thinks space is infinitely divisible and simultaneous. Space is the infinite in the singular. And this is one of the most bizarre elements of intuition. I think it's a way to think about what intuition is and what it means. That it is neither intellectual nor sensory. Right? To say that space is the infinite within the singular is to say something that is intellectually incomprehensible and impossible, and also experientially and sensorially impossible. Space is infinity in the present moment. There is no smallest unit of space. A point in geometry is a purely theoretical idea. So, in theory, not only is space infinitely divisible, but any body, any point, is also infinitely divisible. You can never stop dividing things. As long as you have a unity, you have something that can be divided. Right? So again, a reason to think unity may not be something that actually exists in the world in itself, as it is truly independently of us, but is an idea imposed upon it by our subjectivity. Space is infinitely divisible and all-encompassing, meaning that at this present moment we are living in infinity as space Infinity is contained in everything.